Hey everyone, welcome to our week 5 lecture. This week we're talking about voting and campaigns. I will not be focusing as much today on campaigns for the simple reason that I'm obviously we don't have time for everything, but campaigns is assigned reading for this week. And I hope you'll get to that reading. I'll focus in my lecture on voting because I think it's the more important topic and it's the topic that I'll be focusing on for your midterm exams. So keep that in mind. But I definitely would like you to have a look at the campaigns reading just to get a sense of what's going on in that literature. So voting, we have a lot to talk about this week with this topic alone. Here's just an outline of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to talk about theories of democracy and the way elections fit in our understanding of democracy. We have a habit of thinking that democracy is something once we do every 4 years or so. In fact, most theorists would understand that democracy is a much broader concept that exists in almost everyday life and everyday circumstances. You know, who are we as citizens? How do we reach out to try to influence government and our representatives to try to represent our interests? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But obviously, with the topic of voting, we must focus in on elections. And elections are a very important part of the democratic process. I don't think anyone could deny that. But there's challenges in voting, especially in America. America, probably more than most industrial democracies in the world today, has major issues with the way it runs its elections, from the Electoral College, which even most Americans that I know scratch their heads over, in fairness, to the way certain minorities have been incorporated, or not been incorporated rather, into the voting process and the electoral process. So we'll need to talk about why Americans encounter these obstacles and why, out of frustration perhaps, they have a tendency to not vote at all. It's very interesting. America is among the lower has among the lower rates of participation in or among Western democracies. So that's something we need to talk about. But it's not all doom and gloom, as I will be arguing later in the lecture in part 2. We have a tradition of grassroots politics in this country as well, and there's a lot to play for. Historically, we've seen great successes in mobilization of voters, and that tradition continues today as well, despite the fact that many people say that there's a serious crisis going on. And I think that's true. It's not to say that there's no hope whatsoever. So we'll be talking about mobilizing non-voters and what possible techniques might be possible to get voters to come out to vote. 1. So we start the lecture with this slide, and we have an aspirational statement here, a statement that speaks to the hope, I think, that many Americans have that their country's history is a history where the democratic promise has unfolded progressively from its founding, wherein not everyone could actually vote. Only people with land really could vote, and of course who were of a certain race. Through the ages, as we see here, the conception of political equality from the Declaration of Independence to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to the 15th, 17th, and 19th Amendments can mean only one thing, says C.J. Warren, Supreme Court Justice. One person, one vote. And this has become, I think, the concept, one person, one vote, that most Americans identify with today. That is to say, a completely democratic franchise where everyone who is a citizen of the country can go to the ballot box and express their democratic wishes for a representative to speak for them in Congress or in the office of the presidency. Now, it's true that this is an aspirational statement, because while Americans do largely agree with the principle of one person, one vote, that is to say, they believe in political equality, many Americans believe that the US is the world's most prominent democracy. And this isn't necessarily true. And we know this is not true because of the amount of people that do not vote in this country. And we'll go into some more detail on this point later in the lecture. But just to give you a glimpse of this for now, 4 out of 10 eligible voters did not vote in the 2008 election. And that's a huge amount of people who are not turning up to express their wishes. So we have to ask the question, what's up with this? Why do people not want to exercise their democratic rights in the United States of America? Why do people not vote in greater numbers? Because certainly there's a lot at stake and people have a lot to vote for. You might want to contrast the situation in America with the recent situation in the fall of 2014 in Scotland, where we have had the vote on independence, where 97% of the electorate was registered to vote, and of this 97%, 80% or more actually turned out to vote. And that is, even by Western standards, quite an incredible achievement. So it is possible in Western democracies to have huge turnouts, and obviously not every vote is going to be on something so huge and epic as a vote for independence, as it was in Scotland. But many people commenting on the Scottish election said, no matter who won, the really important thing to take away from it was that democracy itself was a major winner on the day of that vote. And we'll have more to say about this later in the lecture, but I just wanted to offer you that tidbit as a point of contrast to the state of democracy in America, to show what's possible, yet what sadly tends to prevail here in the United States. So, as I said in the introduction, it's not clear to everyone that voting is actually the best way to exert influence. There are diverse ways to try to legitimately influence public policy, but this is a political question. Some might say that direct action is a better approach than actually voting. And after all, history shows us that this is how it was done by those who invented democracy in the first place, that is, the ancient Greeks. They had a tradition which was also dear to many early American colonists, and also to those philosophers of the French Revolution and Enlightenment like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said that direct representation was the kernel of democracy. Why might that be so? The direct tradition is of course the tradition where I represent myself in the parliament, and in a small city-state like those which the ancient Greeks had, it was more feasible. You could turn up and make a speech and try to appeal to your fellow citizens for recognition of your point of view, and they might vote with you if you were persuasive enough. Today, in a large country like the United States or any other large country, even the smaller ones today are heavily populated compared to ancient Greece. So it's not clear how direct democracy could function in a country that was so big. Obviously, there's no town hall big enough to fit all the American citizens, and of course, the state of technology being so complex, the state of our energy system, all these various things, not everyone clearly would be competent or skilled enough to represent themselves in relation to some of these very serious questions. How could we all hope to govern ourselves, for example, in relation to the question of nuclear power, when not many of us are nuclear physicists or scientists to be able to make our minds up, let alone express a point of view cogently about how such power grids and things ought to be run. But while a direct democracy is perhaps not a fully possible way for us to realize our democratic wishes today, there are ways in which we can influence the wheels of government that do not involve the alternative, usually, to direct democracy, which is representative democracy. After all, we have a long tradition of writing letters. More contemporarily, using the internet today, we can blog. And of course, there's a long history of engaging in direct action, strikes, sit-ins, that kind of thing, occupations, as we saw with Occupy Wall Street, have a place in trying to change the way things are done. Environmental campaigners are among some of the leading practitioners of some of these techniques today, and they are effective. We see in September of 2014 the world's biggest climate change protest in New York City, and on September 22nd in 2014 we had a sort of a semi-Occupy style encampment emerge called Flood Wall Street, which is a kind of a effort to draw attention to policymakers and financial planners of the reality of global warming and the need for change and the need for attention in doing something about it. Clearly, many Americans feel that direct action, taking your case directly to the street, so to speak, is a meaningful way of expressing your views and trying to influence the way things are done. Now, the people who support direct action are often people who believe that, well, frankly, voting isn't that influential. They believe the real decisions are often taken by elites, and they're taken behind closed doors. And they would also argue that the elites are happy, only too happy, in fact, for the masses to think that elections make a difference. After all, elections, the 2008 election of Barack Obama and subsequently, these are clearly occasions that are spectacular. They get people fired up and they make them feel like they have power. So in a way, they're a nice distraction when people feel they have power in a context where they so obviously don't really have power, where politicians don't have a lot of agency to make really meaningful change, then these are, of course, a nice distraction. So that's a kind of a cynical standpoint, but it is a standpoint that has a lot of a merit to it from a factual basis, unfortunately. And if you are of that persuasion, then clearly it matters to take to the streets. It matters to get into the public square where you can shake people up and show them that, democracy is not something you do just once every 4 years. Democracy is, in fact, something that happens when you're out there as an activist trying to inspire people to come together and to demand change directly from those with the power. Voting in that light is a kind of a private activity, whereas in the public space, in the public square, you can actually reach out directly to people and change their views on things. So all of that just to say that despite the fact that we're speaking about voting today, there are these other traditions. There is the tradition of direct democracy, and there are all these other activities that people have participated in, both in the past and also in the present context. Now, as we're focusing especially on voting today, let's talk about democratic participation. Voting, despite the fact that there are these other points of view, is nevertheless seen as a critical function in a democracy if we want to maintain institutional balance, if we want to have the public act as a check, as a barrier on the potential among elites for abuse of their station. We don't want our governmental institutions having too much autonomy from the people, lest they have the view then that there's no accountability and that they can do whatever they wish. So it begs the question then, if voting matters, what criteria can we pose to identify voting that's meaningful. Can our democracy have meaningful voting? Well, it can, so long as two points are kept in mind. And the first would be voice. Now, voice means that you have the ability to formulate your ideas and interests in the public square, in the public debate. That typically is a question of having the vote. And as we'll see later in the lecture, there are obstacles to voting for many people in the United States of America. The second criteria would be the criteria of receptivity. And this really is not so much to do with the ability to vote as it is the ability to listen to difference, to listen to those who have a different point of view than you, to realize that we don't always get our way in politics, and that a fundamental part of democratic life, therefore, is the ability to compromise and to engage in a certain spirit of generosity towards others. Now, there's good reasons for that. One of the reasons that we might want to practice generosity towards others and their points of view is because we know that the ideas of others might actually change our minds too, for the better, just as our points of view, if we express them, might be able to change theirs. And there's a long history in America, we'll cover this later in the lecture, but there's a long history in America of authentic voting. But it is clear today that political participation is largely an activity of the rich. As I will argue to you in this lecture, rich Americans are empowered Americans. They have their act together. They are, in fact, 2/3 more likely to try to persuade people how to vote than less well-off Americans. And in fact, they are 10 times more likely to donate money to voting campaigns. They write more letters to their congressmen, and they participate in elections more often. To put it simply, the less well-off just don't come together to act in this way. If the wealthy seem to act very often and to create organizations to represent their interests often, the less affluent do not engage in this type of behavior. They don't participate in civil society, and for this reason, we should recognize that voting is a major, battlefield in terms of the ability of the less well-off to try to achieve more results for themselves from the political process. The fact that the less affluent don't take up this opportunity begs the question why Americans are non-voters. And as we'll see, non-voting is very much a class phenomena. It's the poorer Americans who don't vote. The wealthy Americans vote frequently and often, and they vote in a unified fashion by and large to represent their interests together. Now, your textbook says that there are two pertinent facts that we need to know about non-voting. The first notable fact is that, as we've argued, Americans don't vote. In fact, we see in recent years the turnout is really just 55.8% of the electorate. And you can see on this table how this contrasts and compares with turnout in other democracies. In Belgium, we have a 93.3% turnout. In Sweden, 82.6%. In Australia, 81%. Those are very, very large numbers of eligible voters turning out to vote. Why would the United States be so low and Belgium so high? One of the reasons Belgium has a high voter turnout actually is because in Belgium, believe it or not, you have to pay a fine if you don't vote. It's about $50. And of course, that might seem an undemocratic attitude. I don't know that it fully explains why the Belgian turnout is so high. After all, $50 is not perhaps breaking the bank sum of money for most people, but and Belgium is a wealthy country. I'm not aware that the same rules prevail in Sweden or Australia or Austria or Norway, however, or France or Netherlands, and those countries do have very large turnouts compared to America. So I would not say that, I would say that maybe why Belgium has a portion of its high turnout explained by the fact that there's that fine. I wouldn't say the whole story is explained by that. Now, the second reason why Americans don't vote is that, well, it's much more to do with income, and we'll get back to this point in just a moment. But let's move on and just have a look at some data that shows us how this first fact of Americans not voting has played out over the decades and generations since the country's establishment. In this slide, you can see that there has actually been a steady decline in voting, especially since the early part of the 20th century. You can see that it's around about this time that the numbers start to really come down. Now, there's a difference here between the way presidential elections are voted upon and midterm elections are voted upon. One of the reasons midterm elections are less participated in is because there's less at stake in people's perceptions. The presidential election is a much sort of higher vote getter, clearly, and midterm elections don't matter so much. Now in this slide, we can address our second fact, which is discussed in your textbook. And as the textbook argues, it used to be in America that your socioeconomic status didn't predict whether or not you were likely to vote. But today, in fact, it appears very strongly to predict whether you will vote or not. And what this means is that the less wealthy you are, the less likely it is that you will vote. Let's just have a look at some important facts here that come out of the data. You can see here among the groups most likely to vote that people with an income of over $100,000 are in fact over 75% likely to vote, and people with advanced degrees, shall we say a master's or a PhD, these are people with very high levels of education, they are voting in the largest numbers that you can see here on this slide. So what does that tell us? It tells us that that poorer people and people with less education, which generally are the same category, are less likely to vote. And indeed, the numbers prove this in no uncertain terms. If we look among the lowest categories who turn out to vote on this slide, we see on the right-hand side those with less than $20,000 a year turning out at 47.4%, and those with no high school diploma turning out at 34.9%. So that really does testify to the idea of what we're talking about here. Now let's look at age group. We see people of ages 65 to 74 turning out 67.9%, and people who are young, between ages of 18 and 24, who can vote, but maybe who have never voted before, likely not to seem that or to feel that voting has very much to offer them, turning out at just 44%. Other observations that we can offer: race is also very much a factor here, it would seem. Now, traditionally, white voters do turn out the most, but as recently as 2012, we've seen a slight change in this, and it turns out that African American voters are catching up, have caught up with white people, and are now voting at 60.2% of the time, whereas non-Hispanic whites are at 61.6%. So that gap has certainly closed. Women traditionally turn out less frequently to vote, but since the 1980s, are voting more often than men in presidential elections, which is an interesting thing to observe. That means that women are catching up with men, or perhaps even passing men out in voting for certain types of elections anyway. So I hope you find that slide interesting. Now, in terms of explaining non-voting, now, in terms of explaining non-voting, as per our previous week's arguments, we have two perspectives on why this is so. We have the elite perspective and the popular democratic perspective. Now, the elite perspective is a little bit perhaps condescending in some ways, because it starts off with the argument, well, why worry? It's people's choice if they want to vote or not. And clearly some people lack interest, and they just don't know much about politics. Moreover, some people are too busy with their own personal affairs. And frankly, some people are not really smart enough to be able to make an educated decision to vote. So we have to consider these facts very seriously and ask the question of how they fit into and how they relate to the purpose of democracy. After all, Nazi Germany was a democratically decided upon phenomena. And this is the elite perspective on this. If you have a lot of dumb people or uninformed people who lack interest, if these people are going to vote, then you might not like what you get. You might get extreme forms of politics, and it's for this reason that I think George Will, who's cited, he's a conservative commentator, a very well-known conservative op-ed writer. He argues that in fact, really, the fundamental thing about democracy is not actually to vote at all, but the fundamental right is the right to good government. And of course, this is a classic elite perspective, and it shouldn't surprise us to hear an elite advocate making this claim. But look at the language, right? That the right to vote isn't the supreme right. The right to good government is better. And this is his way of saying, in that Madisonian voice, that the ultimate thing is stability and long-term stability at that. We do not want short-term turmoil with uneducated voters turning up in droves to express a franchise when they may not be able to make a judicious decision. If we also want to sort of attach blame for the frequency or degree of non-voting, then really it's up to the individuals at the end of the day, and they have only themselves to blame. It's not the fault of anyone else. Everyone has the right to vote, so if you're not turning up, then it's your fault. Now on this slide we entertain a slightly different perspective, and the gentleman in the photograph here is Russell Brand. I'll get to him in a minute. But the basic response of the popular democratic point of view to the elite perspective is that there's two flaws that need to be addressed. And the first is that, look, you can't just have this attitude that if people don't show up to vote, it's not a problem. It's up to them anyway. Because in actual fact, a healthy democracy is a democracy that represents as many people's perspectives as possible. And for that to happen, we need broad participation. But the second point of view really would be to, and I think it's a more elaborate argument here, is that elites don't always see that, in fact, people like George Will, that is, they don't always see that low turnout is not always to do with individual choice. It's not just an aggregate of individual choices. In fact, class is a crucial factor here, because if you look in America, we've seen in the data that poorer people, less well-off people are the people who are not voting. So there's patterns that we can see in the data that suggest that it's not just any old Americans that aren't voting on the basis of individual choice, but whole categories of Americans who are not turning up to vote. So this is a factor, right? And we can compare America to other countries in this regards. And we see in these other countries huge difference actually, because in these other countries, these advanced democratic economies that have strong democratic traditions, just like America, that class is hardly a factor at all. So why might this be so? Well, in America, it just so happens that, and this speaks to the book's citing of a political scientist by the name of Schatzsnyder, who talks about the concept of bias of conflict. Um, the point is that we have a kind of a chicken and egg dilemma. People who organize people to come out and vote are usually looking at voter rolls to try to see who the people are in the past who have voted. And they go to those people who have voted in the past and they ask them their points of view on the issues. And so those people who have a habit of voting, whose names show up on the voter rolls, are the people whose opinions are polled time and time again. And so in this way, in fact, it's the desires of people who haven't voted in the past that fail to be considered when politicians are deliberating on what issues they want to go to the people and stand for when they're coming up for election. Politicians who have been successful in the past, of course, are going to have very little motivation to change course. What's worked for them before will work for them again. Changing their language to try to mobilize new voters is risky because you don't always know how they'll vote, and you don't know how this new language will affect the people that have voted for you in the past. So we end up with this problem, as I said, a chicken and egg situation, or a vicious cycle, if you will, that the people who haven't voted in the past don't get consulted about the issues that concern them. The people that have voted in the past do get consulted. And so really, the issues on the table are going to be the issues that are more pertinent to people who have a habit of voting. And as we know from the data, those are the well-educated and the wealthy. So if people are apathetic, then in the face of all of this, if people are not voting, perhaps it is with good reason. This is what your textbook terms a silent vote of no confidence. That is to say, and this is why Russell Brand's photograph is in here, because in fact he advocates not voting. He himself says that he doesn't vote, and he's proud of that, and he suggests that this is an entirely honorable political position to take, because you are refusing to endorse an illegitimate system with your vote. If you vote for a system that is only half-baked, not really making much of an effort to represent your points of view, then you're basically sending a message to the politicians that everything's okay and nothing needs to be changed. What Russell Brand argues for is a mass defection from the institution of voting. He believes that that's the best way to really get politicians to pay attention. Now in this slide, we have a number of obstacles to voting that we can identify. And having talked about the fact that people may voluntarily not want to vote, people like Russell Brand, we also have to consider the fact that there are a number of people who do actually want to vote and who can't for a variety of different reasons. So what structural obstacles can we say exists in America to prevent people from voting? This is again a part of the democratic perspective, the popular democratic perspective in responding to the elite theory's views on the idea that non-voting is a non-issue. So the first thing we can touch on here are registration problems. Americans, unlike in other countries around the world, Americans are actually personally responsible themselves for being sure that they are registered to vote. In other countries around the world, that registration is automatic. If your name is on an official post office registry, you will get a ballot in the mail automatically. So where does this habit come from? Many people say that it comes from a sort of encounter with basically racial issues, that so-called Jim Crow laws, for example, were deliberately deployed, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about race later in the semester. I'll tell you more about Jim Crow laws. But they were laws basically introduced in many of the southern states to keep black people from voting. And that history, of course, still continues to shape voting behaviors, as I will detail in a minute. But another factor is the workday voting. Introduced in 1845, we have a mandate that voting should take place the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November in the electoral year. Now, many countries think that this is a bad idea, and they instead have their elections on a holiday, a voting holiday, or on a weekend. This is to, of course, get people out to vote. Unfortunately, my own country, Ireland, doesn't do this, so Ireland is just like America in this regards. But it's seen by many analysts as being a problem because it marginalizes a lot of people who would otherwise want to vote. They can't because they have to work. So what does it mean to have a lack of national election standards? Well, it means that state by state, you can have different procedures for voting, and this creates all kinds of incongruence. Some states are going to use electronic voting systems, others are going to use paper ones. Some are going to mandate organization of voter rolls one way, some another way. Indeed, and this segues to the next point, because there is no constitutional guarantee of the right to vote, different states are able to take different attitudes, for example, to the status of felons with regard to voting. It's estimated that in America, 4.5 million people cannot vote because they have felony records, and they live in states where a felony record is grounds for denying you the right to vote. And of course, I have here on the screen, and I'd like to draw your attention to a recent book by Michelle Alexander, who is a political scientist who's looked at what she calls new Jim Crow laws. She argues that this felony record tendency in certain states to deny people the right to vote if they have a felony affects black men disproportionately to everyone else. And so consequently, even if they've done their time, and according to the law, they are no longer, under any burden of guilt, they have redeemed themselves according to the edict of the court. Michelle Alexander is saying that the states that have these laws tend to be states that would benefit from, with power elites rather, who would benefit from having the fewer black men voting. And in the same breath, we can also consider the new voter ID laws. Some groups have studied this, argue that there's little evidence of actual voter fraud. So why do we have a recent sort of spate in a number of states over the last 10, 15 years of introducing requirements to have government-issued IDs, like a driver's license, if you want to vote? It hasn't always been the way in America that you need that, and not all states do require it, but conservative commentators argue that it's only a matter of principle that people should have to have an ID in order to be able to vote. But many people reject that, saying that the agenda here really is to disenfranchise poorer people who lack government IDs quite often, and that they have de facto serves as an obstacle to allowing them to vote. So the next point is the Electoral College, and I'll have an interesting slide for you on the next slide, an interesting diagram for you on the next slide, which shows you, just how sort of skewed the Electoral College makes the weighting of the votes of different Americans. And many people would say that that is actually an obstacle to voting of sorts. Because while, of course, technically speaking, it does allow you to vote, the Electoral College means that there's a weighting system so that votes, for example, in Wyoming count much more than votes in other parts of the country. We can also talk about winner-take-all elections. Winner-take-all elections are interesting, right? I mean, not every country does this. America has a winner-take-all plurality system, as it's known. And what does that mean, a plurality system? Well, it means that whoever gets the biggest slice of the pie of votes in any election is going to win the election. And so what that means, because America is de facto a two-party system, that most of the time when voters are going to the polls, going to the ballot booth, they are being confronted with a lesser of two evils situation. They're going to vote for the person they dislike the least. Other countries seem to have found ways to change this up a bit. Like in my own country, for example, in Ireland, we are one of the few countries that actually has what's called proportional representation. Now, it's not common, I'll be the first to admit that, but some countries have it. And what it means is that you can have multi-seat constituencies. In other words, 3 or 4 people running as representative, or spaces for representatives in your district. And it means that you can avoid this lesser of two evils approach. You can take risks and vote for another candidate on your ballot who is not your first preference. So the first preference goes to the lesser of the two evils, of course, and that just makes sense from a rational voting perspective. But the possibility then is for you to be a bit more adventurous with your second preference and your third preference and so on. So that what that means is then that if your lesser of two evil first choice gets elected, any surplus votes that he had over and above the amount needed to be successfully elected can then be transferred, and they're transferred to the second preference vote, and then on and so on and so on until you have all the seats are filled, which is kind of an interesting approach, because what it allows, the risk-taking that it allows a voter, means that you're going to get more unusual voices. You're going to get less common voices represented in the parliament. The fact that America doesn't have something like this means that quite often you're going to be looking at states that are deemed safe, where parties may not even contest the election because they don't believe it'd be worth their while from a financial point of view. Now, Ohio, of course, is a swing state, so that means that a lot of money gets plowed into Ohio at election time because various groups are interested in having people in Ohio vote for them. But, in a solid blue or a solid red state, those contests are less likely to happen. And in 2004, we saw that 27 states were deemed to be safe in that manner. And then, of course, we have the fact that there's non-competitive elections. Quite often, the elections don't really result in a change. When we look at Congress, for example, in 2004, 98% of the incumbents won their election. And of those, 95% won in a landslide. So that basically means that if they've been elected once, they're likely to be elected again. That's not a lot of movement. That's not a lot of change. And it means that Americans don't get access to real choice when it comes to election time. So all that to say that there are serious obstacles to Americans voting, and those need to be addressed. It's not just a matter of choice, as the elites are arguing. Now, I did mention in the previous slide that I wanted to talk with you about the distortion effect of having a weighted vote system for representation in Congress. And you can see here how the amount of voters per seat in Congress is determined. We have 134,000 voters per seat in Wyoming, and Wyoming having a very large number of seats proportionate to its total population, compared to other states which have much lower amounts of representation and much lower amounts of votes that they can allocate to their electoral college. So you need to keep this in mind when you think about how your vote matters. Ohio has only one seat per 440 or 430 odd thousand. So clearly Ohio matters. The Ohio vote matters, only about a fourth then as much as a single voter in Wyoming. This begs a huge question for the country, when it comes to voting for the president. Do we get the will of the people, or do we get the will of the Electoral College? More times than not, the Electoral College vote matches the vote of the will of the people. But in 2000, in the famous electoral battle between George Bush and Al Gore, which ultimately had to be decided by the Supreme Court, it's clear that the Electoral College vote went against the will of the people. In actual fact, had the popular vote being counted, not the electoral count, Al Gore would have been elected in a landslide. So it does matter, right, that we have an Electoral College, and it does change things. Now in this slide, we want to address the topic of grassroots politics. And as I'm arguing here, voter turnout rises when people with little political power form strong social and community groups that lead to their collective power and then to politics. It's not all doom and gloom. When you have these rare moments of groups coming together to engage in politics collectively, and there's a tradition of this in America, the result is popular participation and enfranchisement. And we have examples of this. The civil rights movement in the 1940s and 1950s, for example, wherein African Americans and their various allies organized themselves to campaign for electoral reform. It was very, very successful. And the actions of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who's pictured here, among others, led Congress and President Johnson to introduce the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And that was a grassroots movement that helped shape and change the predicament of African Americans in this country, who were often, up until that point in time, and many would argue still today to a certain extent, marginalized by the way voting was administered. That's definitely one successful example of a grassroots movement. We also have to consider the Tea Party, which came out of the major defeat of the Republican Party in 2008 elections. The Tea Party, I think, is a controversial movement, but many people argue, and I think it's fair to say, that it is a grassroots movement. There's many people at the grassroots level who were active for it and helped bring people out and generate awareness of the Tea Party platform. Some critics do argue that the Tea Party is not a real grassroots movement, and that's why they say it's an astroturf movement. Why would they say this? Well, they argue that the Tea Party receives major financial backing from wealthy people like the billionaire Koch brothers, for example, and they would argue that in order to be a real and authentic grassroots phenomena, it probably shouldn't have that. But nevertheless, it does exist, and I think the sentiments that it draws energy from are real sentiments. So I'm a little bit concerned that we not make too much hay of this astroturf concept, because I think it does sort of take away from the authenticity or distract us from the authenticity of the actual heartfelt views that many people have in favor of the Tea Party. Since coming to power, the Tea Party has, since coming to life. The Tea Party has importantly been a success. It's been a major thorn in the side of the Republican National Committee, which is the organizing apparatus for the Republican Party, which has had to radically change its language in order to accommodate the Tea Party. The Tea Party had a lot of people elected into Congress, and these people have had to be listened to by the Republican higher elites and upper echelons. Now the Tea Party hasn't been doing well of late, unfortunately for them. There has been a decline in support from 2010, the height of its power in the aftermath of the first election of Barack Obama, to about 8% in January 2013 in the aftermath of the second election of Barack Obama. So we have back in 2010, 24% of Americans identified with the Tea Party, whereas only 8% of them do from January 2014. So that does seem to suggest that there's been a major decline, a precipitous decline, in fact, of support for the Tea Party, although, of course, a lot of them still are in Congress and still maintain a voice. A third example of a grassroots political movement that matters is the Occupy Wall Street movement. And this didn't really start in America. I think the American version drew a lot of its inspiration from things already going on in Europe, and also in the Middle East with the so-called Arab Spring. Egypt that spring having sort of had a peaceful coup. And I think this sort of idea of the Occupy movement became global and not just American in that sense. But I think the useful thing about all of these movements, the movement of the Civil Rights Campaign, the Tea Party, and Occupy Wall Street, is that and we'll talk more about movements later in the semester, but for now anyway, I think the most important thing as it pertains to voting is that they show that while associational life is not as powerful as it once was in America, that there's still sort of life in the old dog yet. The global movement of Occupy Wall Street, came back and reinserted itself into American politics, and I think was of major importance in shaping the electoral prospects of Mitt Romney in his campaign against Obama in 2012. Remember, the Occupy Wall Street slogan was "We are the 99%," and what was it that Mitt Romney got in trouble for? But a leaked video claiming that 45% of Americans wouldn't vote for him because basically they were addicted to welfare, more or less. And so, naturally they're going to vote for the guy that's going to give them welfare. And what Romney was really saying in that breath was that, Obama was really a populist and that he was buying votes through promising favors to people, to the masses. This seemed to be a very kind of cynical and condescending message to a lot of people, and many people say that as a result of that, Mitt Romney lost the election. So in this is our last slide for today. We have the question of mobilizing non-voters. I talked at the start of the lecture about the Scottish example, and I want to draw that to your attention once again. One of the reasons why the Scottish vote was so participated in was because activists went door to door and literally, spoke to people, handed out leaflets, and got them to sign up and promise and commit to coming out to vote. And they appealed to them, it is said, because of their their basic sort of capacity to sort of listen carefully, right? So the point here would be, if you go out and try to register people to vote and you listen to them, they often may sign up, right? But the thing is, we're not doing that, right? As I said earlier on, we're not going to the non-voters. We're not appealing them to them directly. It raises the question, the Scottish example does, of what would happen or what happens when these non-voters turn up all of a sudden. Well, today in Scotland, they're having a conversation about a new party. Perhaps there being space for a new party because there's so much energy in Scottish politics right now. And a lot of these people haven't voted before, as you know. But so let's apply that to the American context. I think you can say, it's possible that if all these non-voters were suddenly to start showing up, that it might benefit the Republican Party or it might the Democratic Party. But it's equally likely that it could be the thing that would change American politics and create perhaps a third party. So, this leaves us with a question then, how to overcome what I mentioned earlier on as the chicken and egg dilemma, right? We would love to have all these voters come and join us when we go to the ballot boxes. But on the other hand, those voters aren't going to show up if they're not reached out to and sort of given an indication that the system has something to offer them. So long as the system doesn't offer them anything, those people aren't going to feel very empowered and they're likely not going to want to show up and vote. So it is a chicken and egg situation, right? Which is going to come first? The voters are going to organize, or they're going to see that their issues are being listened to. If they don't see their issues are being listened to, then they may just drop out, and that's perfectly understandable, I think, under the circumstances that they might do that. So there you go, perhaps a shorter lecture for this week, folks, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Thank you.